I was sitting on the couch pretending to watch the baseball game. The sound of the announcers droning on about stats barely registered. Instead, my eyes kept drifting to the kitchen where Jessica stood, wiping down the counter after dinner. Her movements were too fast, too practiced, like she was rushing to get through it. I'd seen that before, but tonight it felt different. It wasn't just about getting the chores done. It was about getting away from me. She'd been distant for months now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way she lingered a little too long over her phone, the late nights at work that seemed to pile up all of a sudden. I told myself I was being paranoid, that work could get busy, that people drift sometimes. But it wasn't just that. It was her silence. The quiet dinners where we barely spoke, the way she turned her back to me at night. The spark we used to have was gone, and I was starting to think I knew why. Then it happened. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and I glanced over, trying to seem casual. She shot me a quick look, her hand moving faster than I'd ever seen, flipping the phone over, screen down. Something in me clicked. Jessica wasn't just hiding something, she was hiding someone. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice casual, like I wasn't already sure of the answer. She didn't even meet my eyes. "Yeah, fine. Just a work thing." I nodded but didn't say another word. I wasn't going to press it. Not yet. But I could feel my pulse quickening, the blood rushing in my ears. The pieces were coming together, and I wasn't sure I liked where they were leading. That night, while Jessica was in the shower, I made my move. Her phone was still locked. Of course it was. That hadn't been the case before. She used to leave it lying around, not a care in the world. But now? Now it was locked, and that told me everything I needed to know. I stood there for a second, staring at it, and for the first time I realized this wasn't in my head. This was real. My wife was keeping something from me, and I wasn't about to sit back and do nothing. I knew I needed proof, something more than just gut feelings. So the next morning, I called a private investigator. It felt weird doing something like that, but I couldn't let her see me sweat. I had to play it smart. I went about my day like nothing had changed. Jessica was back to her usual routine. Quick kiss goodbye, rushing out the door. Barely a word exchanged, but I wasn't thinking about that anymore. I was thinking about the next steps. The investigator told me it'd take some time, that these things weren't quick. I was okay with that. I had patience. If she thought she could keep playing me for a fool, she had another thing coming. The waiting, though, that was the hard part. Every little thing started to stand out. The way she smiled when she got a text but wouldn't show me the message. The way she dressed up a little more than usual for a casual lunch with her coworkers. I'd catch her staring at her reflection in the mirror, adjusting her hair, her shirt, like she was trying to look perfect. Not for me. For him, I wasn't stupid. The signs were there, clear as day. I kept telling myself to wait for the investigator's report, but every day that passed, the knot in my stomach tightened. I couldn't help it. I started paying attention to the details, looking for cracks. It was in the small things, the way she'd slip away to take calls in another room, her laugh quieter than before, like she was trying to keep a secret even when it was right in front of my face. One evening I decided to test her. She came home late again, her excuse ready before she even stepped through the door. Work was crazy, she said, her voice too light, too rehearsed. I didn't question it. I just nodded, playing the role of the oblivious husband. But I watched her closely, saw how she avoided my eyes, how her shoulders relaxed the moment she thought I believed her. It was like a game, except only one of us knew the rules, and I was getting tired of losing. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't help but think back to when we first got married. We used to talk for hours about everything and nothing. Now she barely said a word. She'd turn her back to me the moment the lights went off, pretending to fall asleep. But I wasn't fooled. I knew her too well. The next day, I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to keep playing this waiting game, watching her slip further and further away from me. I needed answers, and I needed them now, so I tried again. While she was in the shower, I went for her phone, but it was still locked. I felt the anger bubbling up inside me. my fingers itching to confront her right there. But I held back. No, I needed to be smart about this. Emotional outbursts wouldn't get me anywhere. I called the investigator, hoping for an update, anything. But all he had for me was more waiting. Give it another week, he said. We're close. Close wasn't good enough. I needed proof, something solid, something I could use. But I didn't show my frustration. Instead, I thanked him and hung up, grinding my teeth. Jessica was slipping through my fingers, and I felt powerless. But I wasn't going to let her win. She thought she had the upper hand, thought I didn't see what was happening right in front of me. But I did. And once I had the proof, once I had everything lined up, I'd be the one walking away, not her. I spent the next few days watching, waiting. Every glance she shot at her phone, every little smile when she thought I wasn't looking. It was all adding fuel to the fire. My mind kept spinning, running through every scenario, trying to figure out just how long she'd been sneaking around behind my back. And with who? Was it someone at work? Someone from our circle of friends? The thought made me sick, but I pushed it down. I needed to stay focused. One night, while she was out running errands, I went through her closet looking for anything out of place. That's when I found it. A new dress, something sleek, something she wouldn't wear around me. It still had the tags on, fresh from the store. She hadn't mentioned buying anything new, and I knew why. It wasn't for me. My gut twisted, but I stayed calm. I couldn't let her see how close I was to snapping. If I confronted her now, she'd just lie, just like she always did. I needed to play this smart. I couldn't afford to mess this up. The investigator called the next morning. We're almost there, he said, but it wasn't enough. He needed more time, and I didn't have it. I was ready to explode. I wanted to grab her, shake her, make her admit what she'd been doing. But I couldn't, not yet. So I waited. I played the game, just like she wanted. But I wasn't going to be the fool in this story. She thought she was winning, thought she had me wrapped around her finger, but I was just biding my time, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when that moment came, she wouldn't know what hit her. For now, though, I had to sit tight. The private investigator was doing his job, and I had to trust the process. It was eating me alive, the thought of her with someone else. But I couldn't act on it, not until I had the proof. And once I did, she'd regret every single lie, every smile she gave him, every time she thought she was getting away with it. She had no idea who she was messing with. The days dragged on, each one worse than the last. Every time she smiled, every time she laughed, I felt it, that sharp stab in my chest, but I kept my cool. I wasn't going to let her see how much it hurt, how much she was breaking me apart piece by piece. She thought she had the power, but that was about to change. And when it did, I'd be the one walking away. Days dragged into weeks, and I grew more impatient by the second. Each interaction with Jessica was like a slow-motion punch to the gut. She'd gotten too comfortable, too cocky. I watched her slide into the role of a woman who believed she had complete control over her situation, over me. It was almost amusing watching her play out the charade of a loving wife while sneaking off to God knows where. Her fake smiles, her dismissive responses, they were all adding fuel to the fire inside me. She thought I was oblivious, but I was anything but. The investigator had told me to sit tight, that they were closing in. Just give me a little more time, he kept saying. But every day I waited felt like an eternity. My mind was on high alert, constantly scanning for any subtle shift in her behavior, anything that would give me an edge. And there were plenty. The late-night grocery runs were starting to get more frequent. She didn't even bother dressing down anymore. She'd leave the house in tight-fitting dresses, new heels, and perfume that wasn't for me. I couldn't tell if it was arrogance or if she just stopped caring. Either way, I was about to get the upper hand. One night, she left again for one of those impromptu errands. This time, I didn't even ask where she was going. I let her waltz out the door, her heels clicking on the floor as she practically floated out with excitement. I waited a few minutes to make sure she was gone before heading upstairs. There was something I needed to check. I started with her closet. Everything seemed normal at first glance. Same old clothes, shoes neatly lined up, Nothing that screamed out of place, but something caught my eye. A small, sleek box tucked into the corner, almost hidden behind a row of winter coats. I reached for it, my hands moving faster than my mind could process. Inside was a lingerie set, black lace, brand new, tags still on. She hadn't bought this for me. My jaw clenched so hard I thought I might break a tooth. She was getting careless. She didn't even bother hiding it properly anymore. That wasn't all. There was another item in the box, a pair of heels, also brand new. I knew Jessica well enough to know she'd never wear something like this on a casual night out. These were for someone special, someone who wasn't me. The investigator was moving too slow. I needed to take matters into my own hands. After all, I knew her better than anyone. I knew how she thought, how she operated. I could predict her moves. So while I waited for the investigator to pull through, I decided to check her old laptop. It was buried in the back of the closet, something she hadn't used in years, or so I thought. It took me a while to remember the password. The machine was ancient, slow, but it worked. As I clicked through the folders, I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. There, in her email inbox, was exactly what I had feared. Cryptic messages from someone named Steve. He was asking about meeting up at some hotel, talking about the good times they'd had, and how he couldn't wait to see her again. I scrolled through the emails, my heart pounding in my ears. It was all there, out in the open, written in plain text. They had been meeting for months, maybe longer. Hotel after hotel, message after message, making plans, confirming times, even sharing details I wished I hadn't seen. Rage boiled up inside me. My hands were trembling, but I kept scrolling, needing to know every detail. This wasn't just about cheating anymore. It was about how stupid she thought I was. Did she really believe I wouldn't figure it out? That I'd just keep playing the fool while she pranced around with her lover? I had enough. I closed the laptop, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. But I couldn't act on them yet. Not now. I needed to stay calm. I needed more. That night, Jessica came home, her cheeks flushed, a satisfied look in her eyes. She didn't even notice me sitting on the couch, watching her closely as she made her way up to the bedroom without saying a word. The smirk on her face told me everything I needed to know. A few days later, I got the call from the investigator. He had the photos, clear shots of Jessica walking into a seedy motel with Steve. I asked for the details, but I didn't really need them. I had enough proof already. But this sealed it. It was real. It wasn't just my suspicions anymore. It was fact. I wanted to confront her right there. The anger bubbling inside me was too much to handle, but I stopped myself. This needed to be done right. I wasn't going to blow up in some emotional outburst that she could twist to make me the bad guy. No, I was going to let her hang herself with her own lies. That evening, I waited for her to come home. She was later than usual, no surprise there. I sat at the kitchen table, pretending to go over some work papers. When she finally walked through the door, I didn't even look up. I just asked, "Where were you?" She paused for a second, just a second, but I caught it. Then, as if nothing had happened, she shrugged. "Work ran late." It was almost laughable how casual she was about it, as if she wasn't hiding the biggest betrayal of our marriage. I could feel my teeth grinding together, my fists clenching under the table. But I didn't explode. I couldn't. Not yet. I let the silence hang between us for a moment before looking up at her. "You sure about that?" She raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk playing on her lips, like she was amused by my question. "What's that supposed to mean?" I stood up slowly, taking a deep breath, and looked her dead in the eyes. "Where were you?" For a second, I saw something flicker in her expression. Fear. No, it wasn't fear. It was annoyance. She tilted her head, crossed her arms, and stared back at me with that same arrogant smirk. "He's a real man," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest, but I didn't let it show. I stood there staring at her, waiting for her to say more. But she didn't. She just turned her back on me and walked away. Like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. I stood there frozen, my fists shaking with the effort it took not to grab her, not to scream at her, but I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. No, I wasn't going to let her win. This was far from over. In the days that followed, I started documenting everything, every lie she told, every time she left the house with some weak excuse, every time she spent money on things she never used around me. I took pictures of the lingerie, the receipts, and the messages I found. I made sure I had everything I needed, down to the smallest detail. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. Her words, the way she looked at me with such disdain, like I was beneath her. It fueled me. Every day I kept my head down, playing the role of the oblivious husband. I was building my case against her. Her indifference became more blatant after that. She barely even bothered hiding her phone anymore. And every time she left the house, she did it with that same smug smile. She thought she had me wrapped around her finger. She thought I was too weak to do anything about it. But I wasn't weak. I was waiting. And then, something shifted. I had started to notice Jessica's best friend Sophie acting strange whenever I saw her. She wasn't as chatty as she used to be, and there was this nervous energy about her. I decided to see if she knew anything. I needed to be subtle, though. I couldn't afford to scare her off. One afternoon, I bumped into Sophie at the grocery store. We made small talk for a while before I casually mentioned how distant Jessica had been lately, how worried I was about her. Sophie hesitated, her eyes darting away for just a second before she said, "Yeah, she's been different." There was something in the way she said it that made me think she knew more than she was letting on. I didn't push it. Instead, I planted a seed. "If you ever hear anything, I hope you'll let me know. I'm just trying to make sure everything's okay." Sophie nodded, biting her lip. "Of course," she said, but I could tell she was holding back. A few days later, I got a message from the investigator. Jessica was planning another rendezvous with Steve, but this time, it was at a different location than the usual motel. Something felt off, but I needed to see for myself. I drove to the address the investigator had given me, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I got there, it was clear I'd been played. It was a setup. Jessica had switched things up, probably suspecting I was on to her. I was furious, my mind spinning with the realization that she had outmaneuvered me, even if just for a moment. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel, but I wasn't done. I wasn't giving up. This was just a setback. That night, as I was stewing over my next move, the investigator called again. This time, he had something I could use. He'd caught Jessica and Steve at the usual spot, clear as day, walking into the motel hand in hand. He sent over the photos, and I felt a sick sense of satisfaction wash over me. It was done. I had everything I needed. Jessica had no idea what was coming, but she was about to find out. With the photos in hand, everything felt different. The anger that had been simmering for weeks was no longer overwhelming. It was cold now, focused. I had all the proof I needed, clear images of Jessica and Steve meeting at that motel, a few text exchanges where they set up their next rendezvous, and more than enough documentation of her neglect toward the kids. But I wasn't going to confront her directly. Not yet. I wasn't looking for a dramatic blow-up. I was aiming for something more permanent. The moment I got those photos, I called a lawyer. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. I wanted to know exactly what steps to take next, how to make sure everything went in my favor. The lawyer told me to gather more evidence, anything that showed Jessica's unfitness as a parent, anything that could help secure custody of the kids. That was my priority now. Everything else, her affair, her lies, came second to making sure my children were with me. I started small, careful not to tip her off, complimenting her, pretending I was none the wiser, even suggesting we go on a family trip together. Jessica's guard dropped instantly, her usual smugness fading. She thought she was in the clear, that I was too blind or too weak to see what was happening right in front of me. She didn't realize that every time I picked up the kids or spent extra time with them, I was setting the groundwork for what was coming next. Every time she blew them off to go run errands or spend time with Steve, I made a note of it. The lawyer's advice was clear. I needed to make it obvious that Jessica wasn't interested in being a mother anymore. And to my advantage, she was doing most of the work for me. It wasn't just the affair, it was the constant disregard for our family. The missed soccer games, the skipped parent-teacher meetings, the nights she chose to be out with Steve instead of at home with the kids. I knew exactly what she was doing every time she left, and I kept track of it all. In those moments, she was too distracted by her own game to realize I was playing one of my own. It wasn't long before I set the final stage. There was a family gathering coming up, Jessica's parents' anniversary. She mentioned it in passing, asking me if I'd be going, almost as if she expected me to decline. I could see she was already planning to bring Steve along as her friend, thinking I'd be too naive or too defeated to say anything. But I saw it as the perfect opportunity to expose her. I reached out to Sophie again, this time more direct. I knew she'd been holding back before, but now I needed her on my side. I played it cool, telling her how concerned I was about Jessica, how distant she'd been, and that I thought she might be seeing someone else. Sophie hesitated, biting her lip like she was weighing her options. And then she opened up. Steve isn't the only one, as she said, her voice low. There's been others. She doesn't care about anyone but herself. It hit me harder than I expected. I had assumed Steve was the only one, the main one, but knowing there were others, it made everything worse. But at the same time, it gave me more leverage. I played it off, acting surprised but not too devastated, and thanked Sophie for being honest with me. She didn't need to know just how much I already knew. After that conversation, everything fell into place. Jessica thought she had the upper hand, but I had all the cards. The affair wasn't just about Steve. It was a pattern, a constant disregard for her responsibilities, her family, everything she pretended to care about. And I was going to make sure she paid for it. The family event was set for the following weekend. I spent the days leading up to it preparing. I contacted the lawyer again, making sure I had everything lined up. I even prepared to present the evidence if things got messy during the gathering, but I knew I didn't want to expose everything too soon. This had to be controlled, strategic. The night before the event, I casually mentioned to Jessica that I'd be attending. Her face flickered with something, surprise, maybe even a hint of concern, but she quickly covered it up with that usual smirk. She still thought she was in control. "I'm glad you're coming," she said, her tone a little too sweet. "It'll be nice to have the whole family together." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, it'll be good." She had no idea. The morning of the event, I made sure everything was set. I packed up the kids, dressed them nicely, and even helped Jessica get ready, playing the role of the doting husband. She didn't question anything. Her arrogance blinded her to the fact that the man standing next to her was already halfway out the door. When we arrived at the event, Jessica was quick to move through the crowd, pulling her parents into conversations and introducing Steve as a colleague. I didn't say a word, I just watched. Her interactions with him were subtle but obvious enough if you knew what to look for. And I did. I waited for the right moment, observing how she flaunted Steve in front of everyone while playing innocent. The kids were off with their cousins, laughing and playing, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing between their parents. But that was about to change. The tension was thick, almost palpable. I could feel the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on my chest, but I kept calm. And then, just as the party was hitting its stride, Jessica's plans began to unravel. Steve didn't show up to the next part of the event. He had been called away for something, an emergency, or maybe he was just getting cold feet about being in the same space as Jessica's family. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. I had planned for this. I waited until everyone was gathered in the dining room, making small talk before the big toast. That's when I decided to make my move. I stepped up, clinking my glass lightly to get everyone's attention. The room fell silent, and Jessica looked at me with a confused, almost annoyed expression, like she wasn't sure what I was about to do. "I just wanted to say a few words," I started, keeping my voice calm and measured, "about family and how much it means to me." I glanced around the room, meeting eyes with her parents, her siblings. Everyone was watching. Jessica stood stiffly beside me, her hand resting on the back of a chair, her knuckles turning white. I could see the tension building in her, but she wasn't sure what was happening yet. Family is everything, I continued. It's about trust, loyalty, and being there for one another. But sometimes that trust gets broken. The words hung in the air, and I saw Jessica's face shift. She knew. She knew what I was about to do. I turned to her, meeting her eyes. Jessica, I said, my voice steady, there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about. She blinked, her face paling slightly. What are you doing, Ryan? I didn't flinch. I know about Steve, and not just Steve, I know about everything. The room went deathly quiet. I could hear the shocked murmurs starting to ripple through the crowd, people exchanging glances, unsure of what was happening. Jessica stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find the right words. But I wasn't finished. I've been gathering evidence for weeks, I said, pulling out my phone. Messages, photos, dates, everything. I held up the screen, scrolling through the images of her and Steve entering the motel, smiling, laughing, oblivious to the fact that their little affair was about to come crashing down. Jessica's eyes widened in horror. Ryan, please, she stammered. This isn't the place. But I wasn't done. You've been lying to me, to our kids, to everyone, I said coldly. And now it's over. Everyone here knows who you really are. The silence was suffocating, everyone staring at Jessica, waiting for her to respond. But she couldn't. She had no defense. All she could do was stand there, her face crumbling under the weight of her own lies. Finally, she broke. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over as she tried to speak, her voice shaking. I'm sorry, Ryan. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I didn't buy it for a second. It doesn't matter anymore, I said, my voice cold, detached. You made your choice. Now you get to live with it. I walked away, leaving Jessica standing there, humiliated and alone. As I made my way through the room, I could feel the eyes of her family on me, stunned into silence. I didn't care what they thought. I had what I needed. That night, after putting the kids to bed, I sat down at the kitchen table and began drafting the divorce papers. There was no emotion left in me, no anger, no sadness, just a cold resolve to get this over with. Jessica thought she had everything under control, but in the end, it was me who held all the power. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose. Today was the day I'd put the final piece of my plan in motion. The family event had set everything in motion perfectly, and now all I had to do was follow through. Jessica was avoiding me. She had been since the night of the family gathering. The guilt was written all over her face, but she hadn't said a word. I think part of her still didn't believe I'd go through with it, that I'd back down like I always did. She was dead wrong. I gathered my things, quietly packing up some clothes and essentials for the kids. I wasn't going to leave her blindsided, not completely. I wanted her to see this coming, feel the weight of it, so I left the divorce papers neatly on the kitchen table with a note. I know everything, Jessica. This is the end. There wasn't much else to say. I didn't need a long letter or dramatic exit. The truth was laid bare, and now she had to live with it. I made sure to take my time getting the kids ready, giving her space to come down and see the papers, to realize that this wasn't just another fight she could win. It was over. As I helped the kids get dressed, they didn't sense anything was wrong. They were too young to understand the complexity of it all, and in a way, I was grateful for that. I didn't want them to feel the tension that hung between their mother and me. For now, they were blissfully unaware, and that's how I wanted it to stay. Finally, Jessica came downstairs. I could hear her footsteps, slow and hesitant, as if she already knew what was waiting for her. She paused at the kitchen table, and I didn't need to turn around to know what she was looking at. The silence stretched on for a few moments before she finally spoke. Ryan, we need to talk. Her voice was shaky, desperate, but I didn't bite. I kept my back to her, calmly gathering the kids' things. There's nothing to talk about, I said, my tone flat. The papers say everything. She stepped closer, her voice trembling with more urgency. Please, Ryan, don't do this. We can fix this. I turned around sharply, cutting her off. Fix it? After everything you've done? Do you even realize what you've destroyed? This isn't something you can fix, Jessica. Her face crumbled as she reached out for me, but I stepped back, putting space between us. No, you don't get to touch me. Not anymore. For a moment, she just stood there, tears welling in her eyes as she stared at me, but I didn't budge. I wasn't going to give in to her tears or her false remorse. This wasn't the time for second chances. I gathered the kids, walking them out to the car. Jessica didn't follow. She stayed rooted to the spot, still clutching the papers in her hands as if they might disappear if she held onto them long enough. But I knew she understood what was happening now. This wasn't a threat. It was real. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced at her one last time through the rearview mirror. She stood there, watching us drive away, but I felt nothing. The part of me that had once loved her was gone. Whatever had been left after her betrayal had withered away the moment I saw those photos, the moment she mocked me to my face. The drive to my parents' house was quiet. The kids were excited to see their grandparents, and I kept the conversation light. I didn't want them to feel the weight of what was happening. Not yet. Once we arrived, I dropped them off with my mom, making up some excuse about work meetings and needing to be away for a few days. She didn't question it, just gave me a warm smile and told me they'd be fine. I knew they would be. My mom had always been the steady rock in our family, and I trusted her completely with the kids. With the kids safe and sound, I headed to the lawyer's office. I wasn't wasting any time. Everything was ready, the evidence, the paperwork, and the strategy. Now it was just about execution. When I walked into the office, the lawyer greeted me with a firm handshake. "It's all set, Ryan. We've got a strong case here. She's not going to see this coming." I nodded, the weight of the situation settling on my shoulders. "Good, let's get this done." We went over the details one last time. The photos, the text messages, the evidence of her neglect toward the kids. It was all airtight. Jessica's arrogance had been her downfall. She'd been so confident that I'd never find out, or worse, that I'd never have the guts to do anything about it. But she underestimated me. The lawyer walked me through the next steps. We were going for full custody of the kids, majority of the assets, in a clean break. There was no room for compromise, no negotiations. I wanted everything, and I had the evidence to back it up. "Are you ready for this?" the lawyer asked, his eyes serious. I didn't hesitate. More than ready. We filed the papers that afternoon, setting the wheels in motion. I knew Jessica would be served within the next 24 hours. I almost wished I could see the look on her face when she realized just how thoroughly I'd outplayed her. But it didn't matter. I wasn't doing this for the satisfaction. I was doing it for the kids, for my future, and maybe just a little for my own sense of justice. I spent the next few days at my parents' house focusing on the kids. We played games, went to the park, and for the first time in what felt like months, I actually felt a sense of peace. The storm was still raging behind me, but here in this moment I was calm. Then the phone call came. It was the lawyer. "Ryan, there's been a complication." My heart skipped a beat, but I stayed calm. "What is it?" "Steve, he's making a move." I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. "What the hell do you mean, making a move?" "He's hired a lawyer. He's claiming that he's in a serious relationship with Jessica and that he's financially supporting her. He's pushing for some sort of involvement in the custody case." The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Steve, the man who had wrecked my marriage, now wanted a say in my kids' lives. It was laughable, but also infuriating. I clenched my fist, feeling the anger rising again. He's not getting near my kids. I don't care what he tries. The lawyer was calm, reassuring. "Don't worry, Ryan. We've got a strong case. But I wanted you to be aware of it. We'll adjust our strategy accordingly." I thanked him, but as I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but feel the sting of betrayal all over again. Not just from Jessica, but now from Steve, a man who had no business being anywhere near my family. But if he thought he could get one over on me, he was in for a rude awakening. This wasn't over. not by a long shot. If Steve wanted to get involved, I'd make sure he regretted it. He didn't know what he was stepping into. The next few days were a blur of legal meetings, strategy sessions, and planning. Jessica was served the divorce papers, and from what I heard through the lawyer, she didn't take it well. I imagined her panic, her desperation. She had spent so long thinking she had all the control, but now the tables had turned, and she was scrambling to keep up. Steve's involvement was the curveball I hadn't expected, but in a way, it only made my resolve stronger. He wanted to play a part in this? Fine, I'd show him just how far I was willing to go to protect my family. The family court date was set, and everything was moving fast. Jessica was pushing back, of course, trying to delay the inevitable, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Every time she tried to claim she was a good mother, I had a counterpoint ready. Photos of her out with Steve instead of at home, text messages where she blew off the kids' events, and of course, the affair itself. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. I was ready for this. I was prepared. I'd spent months laying the groundwork, and now it was time to finish what I started. As I walked into the courtroom, I saw Jessica sitting there with her lawyer. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her hands, her usual confidence gone. Steve wasn't there, but his presence loomed over the proceedings. I didn't care. This was about me and Jessica and our kids. Steve was just a distraction. The hearing was brutal. My lawyer laid everything out: Jessica's neglect, her lies, her affair. The judge listened, nodding along as the evidence piled up. Jessica's lawyer tried to fight back, but there was no winning this. The truth was too damning. Finally, the judge spoke. Mr. and Mrs. West, after reviewing the evidence, it's clear that the best interests of the children lie with Mr. West. Full custody is awarded to Mr. West, with supervised visitation for Mrs. West. Jessica gasped, tears streaming down her face, but I didn't feel a shred of sympathy. This was what she deserved. This was the price she had to pay. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in months. It was over. I had won. But as beneath the courthouse, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number. I'm not done yet. Steve. I stared at the message, a cold chill running down my spine. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. The moment I saw the message, something shifted in me. That cold, detached calm I'd been holding on to began to crack, replaced by a wave of anger I hadn't felt since the day Jessica looked me in the eye and called Steve a real man. It had been infuriating enough dealing with her betrayal, but Steve? The man who had wrecked my life, who thought he could just waltz in and play house with my family? No, he wasn't done. Well, neither was I. I clenched my phone, staring at the screen as if it would offer some sort of answer. Of course it didn't. But I knew what I had to do. I wasn't about to let this guy, this intruder, keep haunting my life. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of thinking he still had some kind of power over me or my kids. The only person who was going to control the outcome of this mess was me. I drove straight to Jessica's house. I hadn't been back since I took the kids to my parents' place, and the thought of returning to that home to her was almost unbearable. But this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about facing down Steve, about finally closing the book on whatever power he thought he had. As I pulled up, I saw Steve's car parked outside. Of course, he was there. It was just like him to be lurking around, pretending like he belonged, like he had some kind of claim to a life he'd crashed into uninvited. I sat in the car for a minute, taking deep breaths, forcing myself to stay calm. I couldn't go in there blind with anger, not when everything was so close to being over. But that sense of control, of planning and precision, didn't last long. The moment I stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, the rage started bubbling up again. I didn't bother knocking. This was my house. Well, it had been, and in some way it still felt like it was. I shoved the door open, and there they were, Jessica and Steve sitting at the kitchen table, whispering like conspirators. As soon as they saw me, the room went silent. Steve stood up, but I raised my hand before he could say a word. Don't even start. Jessica looked up at me, her eyes swollen, probably from crying over the court ruling. Ryan, what are you doing here? I ignored her. focusing on Steve. You're not done? What does that mean? You think you're going to worm your way into this any further? You think you're going to play daddy to my kids? Steve held his hands up like he was trying to play the peacemaker, but the smugness on his face betrayed him. Ryan, I'm just trying to help Jessica get through this. I know this is tough, but we're in a serious relationship, and I'm not going anywhere. The audacity of it made my blood boil. He stood there, in my home, acting like he had some sort of moral high ground. He had no idea what I'd been through, no idea the pain he had caused. I took a step closer, my voice low and steady, but full of venom. You're not in a relationship. You're just the guy who happened to be there when my marriage fell apart. You think that gives you the right to be involved in my kids' lives? You don't know a damn thing about being a father. Jessica stood up now, her voice shaky but trying to sound strong. Ryan, you don't have to do this. You don't have to make it harder than it already is. Steve isn't trying to take anything from you. I turned to her, my eyes narrowing. Oh, really? That's not what it looks like. It looks like the two of you are plotting to drag this out as long as you can. Steve tried to step in again, his voice calm, but I wasn't having it. We just want what's best for the kids, Ryan. That was it. I snapped. Best for the kids? You think this mess you've created is what's best for my kids? You think having you hanging around, undermining me, is in their best interest? You're nothing to them, Steve. You're a mistake my wife made, and that's all you'll ever be. His face hardened at that, the smugness dropping away. For a second, I thought he was going to say something, maybe even take a swing, but then he glanced at Jessica like he was waiting for her to say something. When she didn't, he shifted uncomfortably and crossed his arms. Jessica stepped forward now, her hands shaking, trying to reach some kind of middle ground. Ryan, we need to talk about this. We can figure it out. Steve and I, we're serious. This isn't some fling. He's been there for me when you weren't. That last part cut deeper than I expected, but I didn't show it. I couldn't. This was about power now. About showing them both that I wasn't going to be walked over anymore. You're really going to stand there and defend him? I asked, my voice cold, almost curious. After everything you've done? After everything you've destroyed? You are really going to act like you're the victim here? Her face crumbled for a moment, but she quickly steeled herself, lifting her chin as if she had some right to stand tall in this. I didn't plan for any of this to happen, Ryan, but it did. And I can't change that. Steve and I— You can stop right there, I interrupted. I don't care about you and Steve. I don't care about your pathetic excuses or whatever you think you've got with him. The only thing I care about is my kids. And I'm telling you right now, Steve has no place in their lives. He's not family. He never will be. Steve finally found his voice again, stepping forward. You can't just shut me out, Ryan. If Jessica and I are together, then I'm going to be part of the kids' lives, whether you like it or not. I laughed. I couldn't help it. The sheer arrogance of this guy, thinking he could just claim a spot in my family, thinking he could take my place. Oh, you're going to be part of their lives just like that? Because you say so? He straightened up, trying to look tough. I'm not going anywhere. And that's when I dropped the hammer. You won't have to go anywhere, Steve, because I'm going to make sure you're nowhere near them. I have full custody. The judge decided that yesterday. You, Jessica, you can see them on my terms. And guess what? That doesn't include you. The color drained from Jessica's face. Ryan, you can't. Oh, but I can, I said, cutting her off. The court gave me full custody. And you, Jessica, you are lucky the judge even allowed supervised visitation after everything I've shown him. Steve's face twisted in anger, but I could see the fear behind it. He knew he was losing, that whatever delusion he had about playing dad was falling apart. This isn't over, Ryan, he said, his voice low and threatening. I took a step closer, locking eyes with him. Yes, it is. You're done. And if you even think about pushing this, I'll make sure you regret it. Jessica, her voice small now, tried to step between us. Ryan, please, let's not do this. But I wasn't listening anymore. I'd said everything I needed to say. Steve wasn't going to get near my kids. And Jessica, she was going to have to live with the consequences of her choices. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the house, leaving them both standing there, helpless, knowing they'd lost. I drove back to my parents' house, my mind racing but my heart calm. For the first time in a long time, I felt in control. The battle wasn't over, but I'd won the war that mattered. A few days later, I sat down with my lawyer, going over the final divorce documents. Everything was falling into place. I had full custody, the assets were being divided in my favor, and the house, the one that had once felt like a prison, was mine. Jessica would have to find somewhere else to live. Steve, wherever he ended up, wouldn't matter. As I signed the papers, a sense of finality washed over me. This chapter of my life was closing, and I was ready to move on. Ready to start fresh, without the weight of Jessica's betrayal hanging over me. But just as I stood up to leave the lawyer's office, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my lawyer this time, not Steve. There's another complication in the divorce proceedings. You'll want to come back in tomorrow. My heart sank. I thought I was done with this. But I knew better than to believe that everything would be tied up neatly. There was always another twist waiting in the shadows. Always another fight to be had, and whatever it was, I was ready for it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, the lawyer's words echoing in my head. Another complication. I should have known better than to think it would all end smoothly. Jessica wasn't the type to let go without trying to stir up one last storm. I showered, got dressed, and headed out the door, determined to handle whatever mess was waiting for me. As I drove to the lawyer's office, my mind wandered to the past few months. It felt like years had passed since I first suspected the affair. The man I was back then, naive, oblivious, thinking everything would just work itself out, that guy didn't exist anymore. This whole ordeal had forced me to change, to take control in a way I hadn't before. I didn't need to be that person anymore, the one who let everything slide, who trusted too easily. I wasn't that man, not anymore. When I arrived at the office, my lawyer was already waiting. He didn't waste time with small talk. Ryan, we've got a new issue on our hands. Jessica's pushing for more visitation rights. She claims Steve's involvement is serious enough to justify his inclusion in her time with the kids. I scoffed, shaking my head. Steve? This guy thinks he can just insert himself into my family like that? The lawyer nodded grimly. It's more than that. She's angling for more than just supervised visits. She's trying to play up Steve's stability, his financial situation. She's painting a picture of a new family unit. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. A new family unit? With the guy who helped blow up our marriage? The same guy who's been parading around like he's some kind of hero? Exactly, the lawyer said. We knew she'd try something, but this is a bit of a curveball. We'll need to be ready. I've already gathered more documentation on Steve, and we'll need to emphasize his involvement as a disruption, not stability. I sat back in my chair, letting the weight of the situation settle over me. I had come so far, and now it felt like I was on the edge of another battle. But the thing was, I wasn't afraid of this fight. I had learned how to handle Jessica's manipulations. Steve was just another obstacle, one I was fully prepared to bulldoze through. I'm ready, I said, my voice steady. Whatever we need to do, let's get it done. The lawyer nodded and started laying out our strategy. It was methodical, just like I had been through this whole process. We had the evidence, the facts, and the truth on our side. Steve might have been able to fool Jessica, but he wasn't going to fool the court. And I wasn't going to let him anywhere near my kids. After the meeting, I left the office feeling more resolved than ever. There was a time when all of this would have crushed me, when the idea of Jessica and Steve playing house, trying to take my children from me, would have made me spiral. But not anymore. I'd already won the most important battles. This was just the final step in securing my new life, the life I had fought for. That afternoon, I picked up the kids from my parents' house. As I drove back to my place, I glanced in the rearview mirror at them, both laughing and playing in the back seat. They had no idea how close they had come to losing a stable life. They were my focus, my reason for pushing through all of this. Once we got home, I started dinner while the kids played in the living room. I kept things light with them, asking about their day and listening to their stories. But as I stirred the pasta on the stove, my mind drifted to what the future might hold. The lawyer had mentioned a job opportunity in a different city, a fresh start. I'd been hesitant at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the right move. Maybe it was time to leave the mess of this town behind. New city, new job, new chapter. It sounded appealing, but I had to weigh the impact on the kids. They were settled here, and I didn't want to uproot them unless it was the right decision for them, not just for me. Later that night, after I put the kids to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water, thinking about what came next. The thought of leaving behind the memories of Jessica's betrayal, the bitterness of the divorce, was tempting. But could I really just start over? Would moving away erase everything? Or would the past follow me no matter where I went? I didn't have the answer, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Jessica or Steve have any more control over my life. This chapter was closing, and I was determined to write the next one on my own terms. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings with the lawyer and preparing for the upcoming custody hearing. Jessica's push for more visitation was weak, and despite her efforts, it became clear she wasn't going to win. Steve's involvement in his assent was shaky at best, and the judge saw right through their attempts to paint him as a stable influence. In the end, the ruling came down in my favor again. Full custody remained with me, with limited, supervised visits for Jessica. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like some grand triumph. It just felt like closure, like the last thread tying me to the chaos of the past had finally been cut. With the custody battle over, I started to seriously consider the job offer. Moving to a new city seemed like the clean slate I needed. It wasn't just about getting away from Jessica and Steve. It was about creating a life that was truly mine, free from the baggage of the past. I spent a lot of time thinking about it, talking to my parents, weighing the pros and cons. In the end, it wasn't a difficult decision. One night after putting the kids to bed, I made the call. The job was still available and I accepted. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the right move for us. A fresh start, something I hadn't realized I needed as much as I did. As the weeks went by, I found myself slowly letting go of the anger that had consumed me for so long. The memories of Jessica's betrayal still stung, but they didn't control me anymore. They were just that, memories. The echoes of what had been. I could see a future now, one that wasn't defined by the past, but by what I was building for myself and my kids. The day we moved into our new house in the new city was surreal. I stood in the empty living room, the boxes stacked high around me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. This was it, the new beginning I'd been waiting for. As I unpacked, I found an old picture of Jessica and me from our wedding day, buried in a box of old memories. I stared at it for a long time before placing it face down on the kitchen counter. It wasn't worth tearing up or throwing away. It was just a relic of a life that no longer existed. I'd come to terms with the fact that my marriage was over. That chapter was closed, and I didn't need to open it again. What mattered now was the life I was building for my kids, for myself, and that life didn't include Jessica or Steve. It was ours. Even though I still felt the occasional pang of betrayal when I thought about how everything went down, it didn't consume me anymore. Instead, I used it as a reminder of how far I'd come. I wasn't the man who had been blindsided by his wife's affair. I wasn't the man who let everything fall apart around him. I was stronger now, wiser, and I wasn't looking back. As I tucked the kids into bed that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for the future, for the life we were starting here. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be ours, and that was enough. A few weeks after we'd settled into the new house, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. My stomach dropped for a second, wondering if it was another curveball from Jessica or Steve. But when I opened the message, it wasn't either of them. It was a simple text. "You don't know me, but you need to hear what Steve's been up to. There's more you don't know." I stared at the screen, a chill running down my spine. Just when I thought I'd closed that chapter for good, something or someone was pulling me back in. The drama wasn't over, not yet.